A river disappears from the map. Farms begin to fail. Reservoirs sink lower every month. Power stations cut electricity because there isn't enough water to cool their turbines. Supermarkets quietly import more food from overseas. Prices climb. Cities impose restrictions. Governments promise temporary solutions. And then a simple environmental problem transforms into a national security crisis. When people imagine a country running out of water, they usually picture endless drought, cracked earth, and empty lakes. But that image misses the real story. Countries almost never collapse because every drop of water vanishes. They become unstable because the water they can reliably use is no longer enough to support agriculture, industry, growing cities, and political stability at the same time. Look at a world map, and a pattern immediately appears. Across the Middle East, North Africa, parts of South Asia, Central Asia, and even the American Southwest, millions of people already live under severe water stress. These are regions where demand is approaching, matching, or even exceeding the amount of fresh water that nature replaces every year. This isn't a prediction for the distant future. It's happening now. Water has quietly become one of the world's most strategic resources. It determines how much food a country can grow, how much electricity it can generate, where industries can expand, and even how stable its government remains during times of crisis. The mistake is assuming this is only about climate change. Climate change certainly makes the problem worse. Hotter temperatures increase evaporation. Rainfall becomes less predictable. Droughts often become longer and more intense. But climate is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Population growth pushes demand higher every year. Aging infrastructure leaks enormous amounts of treated water before it reaches homes. Farmers pump groundwater faster than it can naturally refill. Rivers cross international borders, placing downstream countries at the mercy of upstream decisions. Weak governance encourages waste while delaying difficult reforms. Individually, each problem can be managed. Together, they reinforce one another until an entire system begins to strain. To understand why, you first have to understand how little fresh water is actually available on Earth. Nearly all the water on this planet is unusable for drinking or farming because it is salty. Only about 2.5% of Earth's water is fresh water. Most of that is locked away inside glaciers, permanent snow, or deep underground. Less than 1% of global freshwater is readily accessible in rivers, lakes, and shallow groundwater that societies can realistically depend upon. Human civilization has always been built around this remarkably small supply. For thousands of years, cities grew beside rivers because that was where life could survive. Agriculture flourished where reliable water existed. Trade routes followed waterways. Entire civilizations rose and fell according to their ability to manage water. Modern technology has changed many things. It has not changed geography. Some countries receive abundant rainfall year after year. Others depend almost entirely on a handful of rivers or underground aquifers. Some have vast mountain ranges that store seasonal snow. Others sit inside deserts where rainfall is naturally scarce. These geographical realities create enormous differences in national resilience. Experts often measure water availability by calculating the amount of renewable fresh water available for each person every year. Above certain levels, societies generally function comfortably. Below those thresholds, governments begin making increasingly difficult choices about who receives water and who does not. As populations continue growing, while renewable supplies remain limited, that amount steadily shrinks. But geography creates another challenge that is often overlooked. Water ignores political borders. Roughly 60% of the world's freshwater flows through river systems shared by 2 or more countries. Rivers like the Nile, the Indus, the Mekong, the Euphrates and Tigris, and the Jordan connect multiple nations that may have very different economic priorities, political systems, and security interests. That means one country's infrastructure project can reshape another country's future. An upstream dam can change the timing of seasonal flows. Expanded irrigation can reduce the amount of water reaching downstream farmers. Reservoir operations can influence agriculture, electricity generation, and drinking water hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. In many cases, geography gives upstream countries strategic influence without requiring military superiority. Water becomes leverage simply because rivers flow downhill. Yet even these natural limits do not explain the full crisis. Because when rivers can no longer satisfy growing demand, nations turn to a resource that is largely invisible, hidden beneath their feet. And for decades, that hidden reserve can create the illusion that the water problem has already been solved. Beneath the surface lies one of the most important resources modern civilization depends upon: groundwater. Unlike rivers and lakes, aquifers remain hidden. You cannot watch them rise after heavy rain or see them shrinking during dry seasons. They are silent reservoirs built over centuries, and in some regions over thousands of years. For governments facing growing populations and expanding economies, they offer an irresistible solution. When rivers fall short, drill deeper. When rainfall becomes unreliable, drill deeper. When cities demand more water, drill deeper. For decades, this strategy appears remarkably successful. New farms emerge in places that once seemed too dry to cultivate. Harvests increase. Cities spread farther into arid landscapes. Industries expand with confidence. Economic growth continues, and few people question where the water is actually coming from. But hidden beneath that success is a dangerous equation. An aquifer works like a bank account. Rainfall slowly deposits water back into the ground. Wells withdraw it for human use. If withdrawals remain below natural recharge, the system stays healthy. If pumping consistently exceeds recharge, the account slowly empties. Eventually, every withdrawal becomes a loan from the future. Agriculture sits at the center of this problem. Around 70% of global freshwater withdrawals go toward farming. Irrigation has transformed deserts into productive farmland and allowed countries to feed populations that would otherwise outgrow local resources. In fact, irrigated agriculture produces roughly 40% of the world's food. Without irrigation, many of today's agricultural powerhouses could not exist, yet irrigation also creates enormous pressure on freshwater supplies. Across northern India, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and parts of the United States, groundwater extraction has accelerated for decades. Powerful pumps allow farmers to reach water that previous generations could never access. At first, deeper wells solve the problem. When those begin to fail, even deeper drilling becomes possible. Technology delays the consequences. It does not eliminate them. Some underground reserves are known as fossil groundwater. They accumulated during ancient climates very different from today's world. Once extracted, they may require thousands of years to naturally replenish. In practical terms, they are almost non-renewable on a human timescale. Every harvest supported by that water is borrowing from future generations. Cities add another layer of pressure. Urban populations continue growing. More households require drinking water. More factories consume industrial supplies. More power plants need cooling systems. Modern economies simply demand more water every single year. At the same time, climate variability often reduces the amount returning to underground reserves. Longer dry periods mean less rainfall soaking into the soil. Higher temperatures increase evaporation before water can recharge aquifers. Supply slows. Demand accelerates. The gap widens. What makes groundwater depletion especially dangerous is that it remains politically invisible. A shrinking reservoir attracts headlines because everyone can see the shoreline falling. An exhausted aquifer offers no such warning. Water still comes out of the tap, crops still grow, wells continue operating, until suddenly they don't. Farmers begin drilling deeper at greater expense. Smaller communities can no longer afford new wells. Pumps consume more electricity as water levels drop farther underground. Poorer households are pushed aside by wealthier users with better equipment. The crisis unfolds quietly, then all at once. And when groundwater becomes too expensive or physically impossible to extract, countries discover that temporary prosperity has created permanent dependence. The consequences spread far beyond water itself. The first major casualty is food. Every field that loses reliable irrigation produces smaller harvests. Farmers abandon high-water crops. Livestock feed becomes more expensive. Domestic food production slows while populations continue growing. Governments face an uncomfortable choice: either consume increasingly scarce fresh water to grow food at home, or import food from abroad and become dependent on global markets. Many countries choose the second option. Several Gulf states dramatically reduced domestic wheat production after recognizing that growing grain in the desert was consuming precious groundwater far faster than nature could replace it. Instead of exporting water through agriculture, they began importing grain produced elsewhere. In effect, they started importing water without ever shipping a single drop. Economists call this virtual water. Every ton of wheat, rice, corn, or soybeans carries with it the enormous volume of fresh water required to produce it. International trade quietly transfers water across continents inside agricultural products. A nation may appear water secure because supermarket shelves remain full. But behind every imported shipment lies dependence on someone else's rivers, rainfall, and aquifers. The water crisis has not disappeared. It has simply crossed a border. That dependence changes everything. Once a country relies heavily on imported food, water scarcity is no longer just an environmental challenge. It becomes an economic and geopolitical vulnerability. A poor harvest on another continent, a disruption to shipping lanes, or a sudden spike in global grain prices can ripple through domestic markets within weeks. The world witnessed this during major food price shocks. When harvests declined and supply chains tightened, prices rose rapidly across international markets. Countries that depended on imports suddenly faced soaring costs, forcing governments to spend billions protecting consumers from rising food prices. Water scarcity in one region became inflation somewhere else. That is the hidden reality of globalization. Water no longer stays where it falls as rain. It travels through trade, finance, and supply chains, linking the stability of distant nations together. But there is another resource that never crosses borders so easily: rivers. Unlike grain shipments, rivers obey geography. They begin in one place and flow into another, connecting countries that may have competing interests, different priorities, and long histories of political tension. For upstream nations, dams and reservoirs represent development. They generate electricity, reduce flooding, and store water during dry seasons. For downstream countries, those same projects can introduce uncertainty, not because rivers suddenly disappear, but because the timing and management of water begin depending on decisions made beyond their borders. Modern water disputes rarely resemble dramatic attempts to divert entire rivers. Instead, they revolve around infrastructure. How quickly should a reservoir fill? How much water should be released during drought? Who decides when irrigation takes priority over electricity generation? These questions sound technical. In reality, they influence harvests, drinking water supplies, industrial production, and national economies. Across several international river basins, negotiations over water have become permanent features of diplomacy. Some agreements have endured for decades despite broader political tensions, proving that cooperation is possible even between rivals. Others remain sources of ongoing disagreement, reminding the world that infrastructure can reshape regional power without a single shot being fired. In the 21st century, controlling the flow of water can provide strategic influence almost as significant as controlling energy supplies. Eventually, however, every international pressure returns home. If shortages continue year after year, governments face challenges that extend far beyond engineering. Farmers lose livelihoods. Food becomes more expensive. Industries reduce production. Young people leave rural communities searching for opportunity elsewhere. Cities absorb growing populations while struggling to provide reliable services. Public frustration increases. Water shortages rarely create political instability by themselves, but they amplify every weakness already present inside a country. Economic inequality becomes more visible. Poor governance becomes harder to hide. Existing social tensions become more difficult to manage. Scarcity acts as a force multiplier. History repeatedly shows that environmental stress, combined with political and economic pressures, can accelerate instability. Water is rarely the only cause. It is the pressure that exposes everything else. So what happens when a country truly begins running out of reliable fresh water? Contrary to popular imagination, it does not simply become an empty desert overnight. Instead, it adapts. It builds desalination plants that transform seawater into drinking water, though at significant financial and energy costs. It recycles wastewater instead of discarding it. It modernizes irrigation systems to reduce waste. It repairs leaking infrastructure that loses enormous volumes before water ever reaches consumers. It changes crop choices. It reforms water pricing. It invests decades in efficiency instead of waiting for crisis. These solutions exist, but they require money, technology, institutions, and long-term political commitment. That is why two countries facing similar climates can experience completely different outcomes. The difference is rarely nature alone. It is governance. Return to that world map from the beginning. Those highlighted regions are not simply places with too little rainfall. They are places where geography, population growth, infrastructure, agriculture, economics, and politics intersect under increasing pressure. Some will adapt successfully, others will struggle. The future will depend less on how much water falls from the sky than on how intelligently societies manage every drop they already have. Because water is no longer just an environmental resource. It is food security, it is energy security, it is economic stability, it is public health, it is infrastructure, it is diplomacy, it is national security. For centuries, nations competed over land, minerals, and access to the sea. In the decades ahead, one of the defining questions of geopolitics may become far simpler. Not who controls the largest territory, but who can guarantee the most reliable supply of fresh water for the people living within it.